While I'm speaking, I'd like to invite our panelists to go ahead and come forward so I can introduce you. My name is Kim Morrow. I am a senior associate with Verdes Group. We are a sustainability consulting company and a climate resiliency planning company headquartered in Omaha, but also with offices in Lincoln. As Tyler mentioned, I worked with Dr. Don Wilhite in 2015 and 2016 on a series of sector-based roundtables, and that was the follow-up effort to the 2014 report that Dr. Green mentioned, where we took that study out to 10 different sectors in Nebraska communities to have them digest and work with this information to understand the implications of climate change for each of those sectors in Nebraska. So I'm thrilled to be here today and thrilled to see the ongoing efforts that the university is taking to bring this knowledge to our state and to help us all prepare for the impacts of climate change. We are starting off this morning with our first session on the 4th National Climate Assessment, which is this report. You see a summary on your tables. This is the full summary. This report was released in November in 2 volumes. The first volume focused on science, and the second was a full analysis report. The U.S. Global Change Research Program is mandated to provide a report to Congress every 4 years on the status of climate change in the United States. And this is the 4th report that has been produced for Congress. So our panelists here this morning will be highlighting certain sections of this report for us today, focusing in particular on the impacts of climate change for our region. So I'd like to introduce our panelists for this morning and say a word about our format. Doug Kluck is the Central Region Climate Services Director for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. Doug was born in Nebraska, as he says, near Columbus, on a feedlot, but not in a feedlot. But he has lived in Kansas City since 2000. Doug has his undergraduate and graduate degrees from here at UNL. He's worked for NOAA since 1992 with the National Weather Service and now the National Center for Environmental Information, NCEI. Doug's region covers 14 states from Colorado to Michigan. His responsibilities include coordinating and informing on climate service activities among federal, state, tribal, NGOs, academics, and private interests in the region. During extreme climate events such as drought and major flooding, Doug coordinates information response, attribution, and assessment among core partners. Thank you, Doug. We also have John Berge. John is a western Nebraska native who grew up on a corn and wheat farm north of Lisco, Nebraska. John is the general manager of the North Platte Natural Resources District in Scotts Bluff. In this role, he is responsible for all operations of the district, whose purpose and authorities range from groundwater regulation and management to soil and water resource conservation to the management of an expansive rural water system. He joined the district after making the decision to return to rural America after leaving his career in Washington, D.C. In 2009, Berge was appointed White House liaison to the Department of Agriculture by President Obama. In previous positions, Mr. Berge also served as the Deputy Administrator for Field Operations at the USDA Farm Service Agency and the Executive Director of the National Food and Agriculture Council at USDA. He is a graduate of the University of Nebraska at Omaha and the father of 2. He and his family currently live in Gering. And finally, we have Barb Mayes-Boustead. She is a meteorologist, climatologist, and instructor with the National Weather Service. A Michigan native, Dr. Boustead spent 10 years at the National Weather Service office in Omaha Valley, Nebraska, from 2008 to 2018. She served as contributing author to both the Northern Plains and Midwest chapters of this report. Her professional and research interests include historical weather and climate events, severe and extreme weather, improving teaching and communication of weather and climate concepts, and the weather and climate of the Laura Ingalls Wilder books. She currently works at the National Weather Service's Warning Decision Training Division in Norman, Oklahoma. Our format this morning is going to be that Doug will give a 30-minute overview presentation of the National Climate Assessment, and then Barb will give an overview more of the implications for our region, and then John will present after that. So concluding the session, we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A. So let's join me in welcoming Doug Kluck, please.
Does this work? Does this work pretty well? Okay. All right, and then this is my little clicker here. All right, well, thank you very much for inviting me to my state and yours. I love coming back to Lincoln. I'm from Lincoln mostly, even though I grew up partially near Columbus. I'm going to talk about some relatively serious issues. I can't not mention the flooding. You know, obviously this is a big disaster. You're going to see perhaps some implications about flooding, too much water, and from the presentation that I provide, of course this was all written before we had the flood, right? But you'll see some things in there that may lead you to believe that this kind of event may be more likely in the future. I'm not predicting that per se, but let's just go through the science together. This is I-29 in northwest Missouri. You've probably seen enough Nebraska pictures, so I figured I'd show you a couple other states, or at least one other state. I live in Kansas City. I can't go this way home. I didn't come up this way like I normally do. This is the second time. Second time since 2011, right? 2011, we had 3 months of this. I don't think it's going to be quite that long this time, but I-29 was closed. So anyway, a lot of people are suffering. It's not to say that Nebraska isn't extremely important, but it's also downstream. Record flooding at Rulo and other places, which is, I mean, I was stunned when I heard record flooding on the Missouri after 2011. So anyway, keep going on from there. I also wanted to point out, we always saw how cold it was this year, and it was cold across the northern plains in Canada. I just want to put this in perspective a little bit before I get into the presentation about the National Climate Assessment. This is a graphic that comes out of NOAA. Our office down in Asheville does this on a monthly basis. This is February temperatures around the world. Guess where it's the coldest in terms of anomalously cold or unusually cold? Yeah, our backyards, right? And people always say, you know, so much for climate change. I could use a little climate change, right? Well, this is I forgot my numbers, but it doesn't really matter too much. 4th or 5th warmest February around the world since we began our records in 1880. So just think about that a little bit when people say, maybe to you, or you think, gosh, you know, I wouldn't mind having a little more global warming in the wintertime. We just happen to be in the place that caught the brunt of the cold air that existed. This is a perspective looking at December through February. Same thing, looking around the world. Again, this is the 4th or 5th warmest season for December through January or December through February that we've had in the last 139 years, or since 1880, whatever that is. And then this is looking at just 2018 temperatures, just to give a perspective. Again, the 4th warmest year on record around the world. So it's important, I guess, to think globally, even though most of us, I mean, this is human, we tend to think of what's going on locally, right? And that's usually what matters the most, actually. So I understand that. But let's move on now. One more thing before I get into it. This is a sort of record of disasters, if you will. You can go online and find this. I didn't put the link, I'm sorry, but these are $1 billion+ disasters since 1980 or so, when we started categorizing and following these. This is all disasters, and you can't read it, but there's winter storms, flooding, drought, wildfires, tropical storms, severe storms, and freezes. You see a sort of a trend line there. 2018 was the last year. We had quite, and over here on the right side is sort of the calculation in billions of dollars in how much that cost, if you will. And that doesn't capture anything capture everything by any means. So 2019, we're beginning that now. There'll be another, unfortunately, Nebraska is going to be part of that, $1 billion disaster, no doubt, easily, unfortunately, if you will. All right, as Kim already said, this report is done about every 4 years, and you can see why we do it, to understand, assess, kind of get a gauge on what's going on out there. in terms of the U.S., very U.S. focused. Congress mandated this back in 1990. We do a lot of public engagement on these things. We do a lot of review. The public is welcome to review everything. All of that record is online. Anybody can go and look at every question anybody asked about the report and see the response. It's all there if you care to dive into that. It took about 2 years of writing, 300 plus authors, 13 federal agencies, including the executive office of the president, by the way. And there's the, I guess I didn't show that earlier, but there's a website to go to sort of begin this process if you really want to download everything. And there are excellent materials there, which we may or may not get to at some point talk about. Here's how we're split up geographically. There's 2 reports. I don't know if hold on a second. Yeah, there's the 2 reports. Kim mentioned that a little bit earlier. The one on the left is the very science-oriented one, but not written at a terribly technical level. And the one on the right is the one I'm going to be talking, well, I'll actually be talking about both these quite a bit. Barb will be talking a little bit more about the one on the right when we kind of break it down to regions. Let me go back here now. So there are the regions that the second report was broken into. Nebraska is part of the Northern Great Plains section. We'll talk more about that as we go through this. Hopefully Barb will get through a lot more than I will. Because I have too many slides. I'm going to admit that right now, and we're going to get cut off halfway through my slide deck here, but I'm going to get through most of this stuff. These are the chapters in Volume 2. Again, I'm sorry you can't read all this, but the great thing is we cover lots of sectors from water, energy supply, land cover, forests, ecosystems, coastal, oceans, ag, built environments, urban settings, transportation, air quality, human health, tribes, et cetera, and then all these regional chapters too. So it's regional chapters plus all these sector-specific, if you will, chapters which are covered in terms of the assessment of climate and climate change across the country. That's why it takes a while. There they are. These are the messages, sort of, that are pretty important to note. Earth's climate is now changing faster than any point in modern civilization. These changes are primarily the result of human activities. The impacts of climate change are already being felt in Nebraska. Americans are responding. However, neither global efforts to mitigate the causes of climate change nor regional efforts to adapt to the impacts approach the scales needed to avoid continuing substantial damages. So I don't know if I need to prove to this audience anything, really. I'm pretty much a scientist. I pretty much don't believe in climate change. I understand the science of climate change. I hope you get that distinction. People ask me, that's the first question. If I'm sitting on a plane, what do you do? I'm a climatologist. Oh, do you believe in climate change? Or the other one is, what's your opinion? I say, I don't have one. I don't have a belief. But I do know, based on the science, what's going on, if that's your question. And I don't mean to be that snarky. I'm not trying to be snarky. I actually say this in a nice way. This is the global record. These are the temperatures compared to normal since 1880. This is what we see. This is cooler than normal earlier in the century, much warmer than normal, and a trend right on up on the latter half. Here's the temperature changes. The last 40 years compared to, or 30 years compared to 1901 to 1960. That's how much it's warmed. That's where it's warmed, mostly in the northern, the higher latitudes. These are scenarios based on the potential for CO2, different CO2 levels in the atmosphere over the next, next 100, out to about 2100. There are 3 scenarios. This is the observed line of what's going on in terms of CO2 in the atmosphere. The green line represents, I'm trying to remember if that's no CO2 or That's very low CO2, so we cut back a lot. Here's if we would cut back a moderate amount, and here's more or less if we continue on the trend we are now in terms of CO2 production or putting it into the atmosphere. These are maps. These are not projections. This is reality. So these are the maps of the United States and where temperatures have risen over 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit annually, wherever it's red. Winter temperatures are really the driver so far in terms of temperatures. Summer temperatures, somewhat in the southwest and west, have been rising as well. This is not, again, this is not a model or a future outlook. This is reality since, and again, this is looking at the last 30 years compared to the period of record before that. These are projections. These are the climate projections for the United States. The lower scenario, and this is if we do start curbing some CO2 in the atmosphere, that's what these, the two maps on the left show the lower scenario, about 2150, and then the, am I saying that right? 2050, and then the late century of 2100, the degrees of temperature rise that we're likely to see across our areas. And so what we really don't want to see, well, we don't want to see any of these, to be honest with you, but the lower scenario of CO2 output delivers us about a 3 degrees, and we've already seen about a 1 degree in the last century rise. And this is by 2050. 3 degrees, and with the higher scenario by 2050, 4 degrees, and then with the lower scenario, 2100, approximately 4 degrees higher, and 8 degrees higher if we don't do anything about it by the end of the century. This is the modeled projections. What does that mean in terms of projected days above, let's say, 90 degrees in this case? 20 to 40 more days at the end of the century, or mid-century, with the higher CO2 production that we're currently producing around the world. That means basically another month of 90 plus degree days on average. This is on average, not just, you know, a hot year. This is the average year. So take a hot year, if you will, and extrapolate that to every year. And that just means that there will be hot years even upon that. And then the other thing is mid-century, again, higher scenario outlook is for 20 to 30 days less of below 32 degrees. And some of you might think, well, that sounds good. I'd like to live in San Diego too, right? So, but the implications of that are the reason the ecosystem and agriculture and everything else is built up the way it has is based upon a climate that we have maybe 30 years ago. So things are changing, and they won't be good if we continue on the same track. So here's a map of changes in annual precipitation. Again, not modeled. This is sort of observed, if you will. This is what has happened. And again, it's the last 30 years compared to the early part of the century. Where has it gotten wetter? Well, golly, the Midwest and plains have gotten wetter and wetter. So is the Northeast. So is it all the way down to the Gulf. It's interesting. Certainly people in Iowa, Minnesota, South Dakota, various parts of the plains can testify to this. That doesn't mean there's not drought too. It just means, on average, the annual precipitation has risen quite a bit in those areas. Drier in the Southwest, not good news when you live in the desert, right? Here's the projections for precipitation. I think this is pretty interesting compared to when you think about what has already happened in Nebraska this year. Winter, 10 to 20% more precipitation. Spring, there's a tendency for wetness. Summer, not really a strong signal, I would say, either way, and certainly in fall, same thing. But I think it's oh, the stippled, if you can see those little stippled areas, that means there's a lot of agreement among various models. It means there's more, I guess, like I said, agreement and likelihood of those things coming true. It's interesting that winter and spring are getting wetter. We can talk about that. Maybe Barb will talk about that a little bit more, about why that might be. There's lots of reasons for that. Warmer temperatures warmer air does carry a lot more moisture. That's really the bottom line with that. The other thing we've seen is quite a bit of an increase in heavier precipitation. When the old adage, when it rains, it pours, is becoming more and more the case. So when it does rain, this is, again, this bottom map, I'm kind of going backwards here, but the bottom map shows the percentage increase in heavy rainfall from 58 to 2016. That's pretty stunning across the Midwest and Northeast, that you have 42 and 55% of your rainfall, or increase in heavy rainfall events in those places. The Northern Plains, almost 30% increase in heavy precipitation events. The models bear it out. The models for the lower scenario of CO2 release, and this is by the late century, so the end of the century, both show a continued increase in heavy precipitation events across this area, for sure. Oh, I got to the key messages. How much time do I have? About.
10.
Oh, really?
She said 5. She's at 10.
So 5. All right. So I'm going to start the key message themes here that I think are important for the Northern Plains, Nebraska specifically, but Barb is going to kind of continue this conversation as we go. Climate change impacts and adaptation across the Northern Great Plains was one thing that we talked a lot about in our combining the chapter. So Barb was on this helped write this chapter. I helped write this chapter. And there were several other authors. Martha was one of them as well. I'm not sure if anybody else in the room was on that. But there were 6 or 7 of us on this chapter. One of the things we wanted to do is sort of talk about impacts, and I won't go through all of these, but impacts of climate change and what our response has been so far. So this is a nice way to sort of sum up the Northern Plains in terms of, this one down here is increased growing season length and greater variability of temperature and precipitation stress, critically important to natural resources in the Platte River Basin down here. So there is this, and you probably know about it, to sort of categorize and monitor the Platte Basin time-lapse project, which will actually be extremely interesting after the flood to see how things have changed. You know, ice in the Platte River is a natural phenomenon, and it needs that sort of ice moving through occasionally to carve out and keep those sandbars clean and all that stuff. The ecosystem people know a lot more than I do about that. This is what I understand. So it'll be interesting to see how the Platte River responds to this event. Anyway, I just want to point this section out because this was a big part of our chapter. Gives you very good ideas of where climate change is happening, but on the positive side, what we're doing about it, if you will. And there we go. Obviously, water is a big issue in the high plains. Usually not enough of it in some cases. In some cases, way too much of it. There is a trend towards wetter. You saw that in portions of the Northern Plains. There are issues with that we'll talk a little bit about, and again, Barb may talk about some of these things, but one of them is snow in the mountains. The Missouri River Basin is sort of dependent upon a regular snow melt. What we're seeing, however, is that snow coming off earlier due to higher temperatures. That has all kinds of effects, from ecosystem to warming of water, to less water at the right time of the year, and such. I guess I won't go into a lot of detail on that. I invite you to read that. Another one is agriculture. Agriculture is everything, almost everything, in a lot of places in the northern plains. Rising temperatures and changes in extreme weather events are very likely to have negative effects on parts of the region, right? Adaptation will likely require some changes to management, regional shifts. And I stole this from the Midwest chapter because I thought this was appropriate also for our area. Increased soil water availability in many places, especially in the north, decreased in the south, and actually west, I would add to that. Increasing extreme high temperatures during pollination and grain fill is a big problem, can be a big problem. You'll understand that. And that's very dependent upon the timing of pollination and all that for corn and soybeans. Increased abundance of weeds and invasive species. As it turns out, weeds do very, very well in a high CO2 atmosphere, better than crops do. Plants love CO2, right? Alteration of plant phenology, early onset of spring. So plants aren't used to, like this year, this is a perfect year actually of describing a typical cold year or cooler than normal year anyway, going into spring. Plants are just getting ready to bud. Well, in a lot of years, like in 2012, if you remember 2012, how things went down, I don't think it froze after, geez, I don't remember the date now, but I don't think it froze in a large part of the area after March 15th. Or it was such a mild winter. It was incredibly mild, 2012. But in part, and this was true across eastern U.S., but they did have freezes further east, and it did hurt some crops because everything was blooming. Everything was growing and blooming, especially like cherry crops and things like that. Decrease in quality of forage. We've already seen that. Who was saying that? Where did I just read that? I think that was in Missouri. Kentucky, sorry. Stu Foster was telling me, the state climatologist in Kentucky was saying that they had lots of growth because they've had incredible amount of water, but they couldn't get in to cut their hay, and when they finally did at the end of the year, they bundled it all up, it rotted. So this winter has been rough on cattle. It's been colder than normal in Kentucky. The only feed they have is this sort of baled hay, which has fungus and other stuff in it. And the cattle eat it, but they don't gain any weight. In fact, they lose weight. So that's a big issue this year in particular. Maybe, I don't know if that's true in Nebraska. Tyler probably does. Increased humidity. We talked about this a little bit. It's been raining. When I said it rains, it pours and all that business, this fits right into that. The warmer the air is, basically, it holds a lot more moisture. And so as temperatures rise, you have a lot more capacity to rain big events, have big events occur. And that's an issue for agriculture for lots of reasons. We're going to see a lot of these this year across our area. Reduced workable field days, planting delays, replanting, soil compaction, drainage, definitely nutrient loss. People didn't get their nitrogen in on time, etc. Again, Tyler should give this talk because he knows it all. And this year is going to be a real challenge for lots of reasons. I say that also based on the outlook and forecast in the short term over the next few months. Conservation practice, reduce impact of heavy rains. Again, people like Tyler probably preach this left and right in their daily lives, but there's not only integrating strips of native prairie vegetation and row crops, there's also the whole soil health initiative of putting carbon and organic material back into the soil. All these things are, if you will, mitigation and adaptation, actually, processes. And I think I'll stop pretty much right here and mention the mild winters again and how that can be impactful on agriculture as well. Not this year. This is not a mild winter year. We don't have to worry so much about plants, especially fruit trees and things like that, blooming early and then having a freeze following that. But that kind of thing is something to worry about more in the future. Thank you.
Okay, microphone working okay now? Great. So Doug and I have a lot of overlap in our presentations by design because I knew that Doug wouldn't get through all of his slides. So I am going to reiterate some of the messages he communicated, but also maybe focusing a little more closely in on our area in Nebraska and trying to get to know what the issues are a little bit more closely. So I want to reiterate that I am pinch hitting for Martha. I wasn't going to be here until she couldn't make it, so I really appreciate that I could come up and talk climate for a little while. I don't get to do it as much as I used to, and I miss talking climate in the state of Nebraska. I enjoyed my 10 years here working with the climate issues and working with those of you who are engaged in our community. And I did also get my PhD at Nebraska too, so I still have that connection. Yeah, that little guy in the middle. I do that mainly so you'll get your attention up because he's really cute. But you know, he's also my windows on the world and what kind of world we're going to leave him when he grows up and when he perhaps someday has children. So anyway, you covered my biography well, but I just like to throw a little bit up there that I'm grateful to be here. And while I'm not here permanently anymore, it's always nice to come up and talk with you all. So let's talk a little bit about what the climate assessment says in the Northern Great Plains and even more specifically for Nebraska. You've gotten the climate assessment link pretty well hammered at you, but it's here again if you want it, and a little bit of a capture of what it looks like. And I want to focus in on our area, this Northern Great Plains area, which covers 6 states, plus a whole bunch of tribal communities, reservations, regions. But focusing closely in on Nebraska, let's go right to the nitty-gritty and talk about what the changes are projected to be. Doug mentioned that temperatures have already increased and that they will continue to increase. And quite honestly, I don't think very many of us care about an average temperature. What does a 1 degree average temperature difference really mean? Not a whole lot until you talk about what it does to the rest of the temperatures. And that is when you change an average temperature by about 1 degree, it shifts where the extremes go too. So it makes that upper extreme a lot more likely to happen. It makes the lower extreme a lot less likely to happen. So that bears out in the projections. On the left image here, we have the projection of if we curb our emissions to some degree. On the right is the projection of if we keep burning the fossil fuels that we have and keep taking them out of the ground. So you can see there's either a big increase or a really big increase in summertime heat. Now that's something we haven't actually seen that much of yet. If you look back at Doug's observation graphics, our temperatures are not yet increasing in Nebraska in the summer fairly substantially, at least the high temperatures. But that's not something that's going to be the case for long. So we will see this increase in temperatures basically no matter what we do with our emissions. It's more of a question of how much. On the flip side, our cold outbreaks will decrease in a changing climate, either a little bit or a lot, depending on what happens to our emissions. Which, as Doug said, you know, that sounds great. It's not going to get below 28 as much. Sign me up after this winter. Except that, well, that cold has its benefits and purposes in this part of the country. So, yes, it's nice that we maybe don't have to spend as much money heating our houses. However, the cold is what kills off a good number of pests and diseases and infestations to our crops, to our animals, and perhaps prevents the invasion of new species coming in. If we decrease the amount of cold that we get, we allow those predators to invade Nebraska. And that's just one example. Another example is in horticulture. There are some types of growth that we encourage here in Nebraska that depend on a certain number of chilling hours for the trees to flourish and be healthy again in the spring. They need to have that dormant time, which the trees feel by the number of cold air hours. So if they don't get enough of that time, they're not a healthy growth the next year. So there are impacts in a number of sectors, and while it sounds nice to not be quite as cold, there are trade-offs for that. The big rains, right? Nobody wants to talk about big rains right now, but the reality is that the big rains are already increasing, as Doug showed well in his graphics, and will continue to increase, especially in, say, the eastern third to half of the state. That may not actually be the case out toward the Panhandle, where the climate changes a little bit more on the dry side. But those big rains are projected in places that we know don't always have the ability or the capacity right now to handle it well. And we're talking about the number of 1 inch or greater rainfalls increasing, and when that happens matters a lot. Getting an inch of rain in August or July, unless we're already super wet, is usually not that big of a deal. The crops are at full maturity and they can pretty well absorb and take up a lot of that moisture. Maybe you get a little street flooding in the cities, but otherwise we can handle it all right. But when it comes in February and March, when the ground may still be frozen, when the rivers may still be frozen, because climate change isn't going to stop winter from happening. So, we're still going to have frozen ground and frozen rivers. The capacity to manage that becomes a lot more difficult, and there's no better example of that than what's been happening this year. This year is perhaps the confluence of the worst of these factors coming together, but it's also an example of the kinds of things that we can expect in that changing climate. As Doug mentioned, the snowpack will change, which maybe you care about skiing in Colorado, but what we really care about for the state of Nebraska is that snowpack melt is what feeds into the Platte River and other river systems as they come through the state of Nebraska. So if we don't have quite as much snowpack coming through, we can't reliably get the spring flush. We can't maybe reliably bring up the levels for some of the wildlife that needs it. Perhaps the temperatures change, like Doug mentioned. Lower river levels can also ice over a little more easily. There's just a lot of potential impact there. So it might be a bit of a trade-off that, okay, maybe we get heavier rains in the spring, but the river level itself will be a little bit lower to begin with. But I think that the impacts overall of having less of that snowmelt come in is a less reliable signal of when we get that melt off. Our snow melt off from the mountains doesn't typically come in at this time of year. It typically comes in later in the spring after all of our melt off here locally has run off. So the timing being different can change how our water systems behave. And finally, there it is, the stream flows that could be projected to change. And again, this is not something that I know people want to see right now, and I feel kind of bad even showing it. In fact, not kind of, I feel really bad showing this right now, that again, the factors that come together with the changes in temperature, the changes in precipitation, perhaps the changes in stream flow runoff from the mountains are such that our rivers may run fuller, especially at certain times of year, like this late winter to springtime when we're getting more of this precipitation, like Doug showed in his graphics. So there are real concerns about the stream flows of the future, and whether they increase by a little or a lot, I don't know, but the potential is there for more of the flooding that we see now, more of these heavy spring rains providing runoff into the streams at a time of year when they're already vulnerable because they're melting off a little early, perhaps, and perhaps the mountain snowpack came off early that year because it was warm. So overall, we can't look at the flooding that happened here and say, this is climate change, right? We can't look at one event of any kind and say, that's a climate change flood, that's a climate change storm. But what we can say is it's a little bit like in baseball having a player who's on steroids, that you have a hitter, let's say, and they go up to the plate and hit a home run. Well, you can't say that home run was a steroids home run, but that person starts hitting and their average goes up by about, 0.100, 100, right? That pattern is the steroids that are showing themselves. So that pattern becomes climate change showing itself. So this particular event is not necessarily a climate change event, but it is typical of the types of events that we may see in a changing world. And it shows the characteristics of what may occur in a climate changed world. And because I have a particular interest in thunderstorms, I also like to throw this in there that we are starting to study the impacts of climate change on thunderstorms, and especially on the severe ones, right? The big hail or the tornadic thunderstorms. There are some groups starting to research that, and it's still a baby area of research with a lot of stuff still to be determined. But there are some patterns that are starting to emerge. For example, it might be that the number of days that we get tornadoes in a year doesn't change all that much, but we get more tornadoes on those days. It might be that the areas that become more favored for tornadoes are shifted just a little north and just a little east of where the current favored areas are. So overall, the message is it's being studied, and there are some changes that will happen, but we have a lot of work left to really understand that. But I'm glad that the assessment, well, I'm not glad, that is probably my fault that it's in there. I'm glad that we're starting to talk about it in the climate assessment, and it's something we can watch. And it also gives us the ability to say that we understand the fundamentals of climate change very well. We understand that temperatures and precipitation will change. Some of these nuances and details are the parts where we still need to do more work, and that includes things like, will thunderstorm activity change in the state of Nebraska on average? So Doug started in with the key messages, and I am gonna retouch on a couple of them, and then add the last ones that he couldn't quite get to with how much time do I have left? Oh, I'm out of time. All right, never mind. So Doug did a good job covering this, but I'm going to talk about it just one last time before you hook me, and that is that frost freeze thing that he talked about, right? So our late winter and early spring times are warming. Our frost freeze average last date of spring is not changing as fast. It's changing, but not as fast. So what's happening is you accumulate more warming before that last freeze happens, which is fooling the trees and plants around here because they're used to a climatology where that warming doesn't happen before the last freeze, which is why we are seeing these very damaging early spring freezes, right? The freeze itself is maybe not necessarily that late. It might just be on time, but there's more warming before it, and it sets up the plants to be damaged by that frost or freeze that inevitably happens. So it isn't going to happen this year, like Doug said, but it's happening more often than it used to, and it's going to be a continued problem until we warm enough that the freeze dates catch up with all of that, and or the plants that can survive that kind of climatology change in our state. Recreation and tourism. I wanted to get to energy, right? Fossil fuel and renewable energy production is expanding still. Climate change does put this energy supply at risk. This is just one example, the now shut down Fort Calhoun nuclear station being flooded in 2011. And of course, the energy sector is a significant source of the greenhouse gases that contribute to the issues in the first place. And finally, that Indigenous peoples are at an elevated risk of a variety of climate change impacts. They are, as entities, beginning to address it, though, despite the fact that these harmful impacts have already happened. And on your tables is this really great key messages pamphlet, which has all of these words that Doug and I have put up there, so I encourage you to take a look at it and read it for the words. I was only a minute or two late, so thank you very much. Thanks for letting me come.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay? Well, following two PhDs, I will be a little bit briefer than they are. I'm the practitioner in the room, the practitioner on the panel, and so I'm going to focus on two of the key message areas, but I'm going to focus on them hopefully in a more practical way, some of the ways that my natural resources district is addressing some of the issues that are outlined in the climate assessment. I think it's important to note that the assessment and all of the wide variety of information that's available on climate change is something that can be put into practical use and is being put into practical use, at least in some parts of Nebraska, some parts of the northern Great Plains. Just to give you a brief background of our district is 3.5 million acres in western Nebraska. It starts at the Wyoming line at Henry and runs essentially to Lake McConaughey. We are about 500,000 acres irrigated, and the balance of the acres then are pasture, woodland, and what we would loosely define as urban areas, although our most urban area is 22,000 people. We do not have the same kind of precipitation blessings or curses that you all do in eastern Nebraska. We have an average annual rainfall of about 16 inches. In aggregate, over the past 6 or 7 years that I have been at the NRD, we have had a low annual precipitation rate of 6 inches and a high annual precipitation rate of 22 inches. So irrigation is a very vital part of our agricultural industry in my part of the state. We're also not deeply connected to the Ogallala Aquifer. We are predominantly part of what is known as some alluvium aquifers right along the North Platte River that are highly dependent on the snowpack that both Doug and Barbara talked about. That snowmelt has changed dramatically in about the past decade. We have much faster melts, we have untimely melts, and we have melts that are subject to less snowpack than we have seen historically. That has all been exacerbated by several different climate issues, one of which was covered a great deal here, and that is temperature increase. But the second is beetle kill. With the beetle kill that's happening in the northern Colorado and southern Wyoming mountains, we have a faster melt because there is not tree cover over much of the snowpack that exists. All of that has caused a great deal of issues for us to try to manage through. My board comes from about the most maroon part of Nebraska that you can think of. I would imagine that most of our constituents are non-believers, Doug. They are not people that are one to enter into political debates about climate change, but they do recognize the impacts. And as such, about 15 or 20 years ago, my board of directors. For those of you that aren't familiar, the natural resources districts are governed by a locally elected board of directors. We have taxing authority. My board of directors set upon a path to sort of address some of these issues, but not necessarily call them climate change, or at that time, global warming. And I'm glad they did. We have a vast network of monitoring wells in our district, more than many states. We have 850 observation wells. To put that in contrast, the state of Georgia has 400 observation wells. It's a significant tool that we can use in order to monitor not only what happens in the spring runoff, but also the summer irrigation season, and then after the winter snows. That's a very important tool for us to manage water. We also have flow meters on every one of our wells in our district. That way we can manage, or we can monitor and then ultimately manage in some parts of our district the amount of water that is withdrawn for irrigation purposes or for urban purposes, et cetera. On half of those flow meters, we now have telemetry units, so we can monitor that real time. I can tell you on any given hour of any given day what somebody is doing with one of their irrigation wells on at least half of those wells. That's important so that we can more real time monitor what's occurring on the ground. With those telemetry units, we also have the ability to collect weather data. They have sensor ports on each of those telemetry units, and we have the opportunity to turn almost 900 of those telemetry units into 900 different weather stations across the district. That's also an important tool for us. We also entered into an arrangement with Martha just a couple of years ago on bringing in 2 Mesonet stations into our district, expanding that network as well. What do we do with all that data? Well, that's kind of what I'm getting to. The data that we collect, ours is a very data-driven NRD. The data that we collect, we then use for all of our management decisions. We have been deficit irrigating in our district for over a decade. Our yields haven't diminished. We've just gotten really, really good at deficit irrigation. We retime and time better our irrigation practices. And because of that, we are still growing 250 or 300 bushel corn in an area where we're getting between 10 and 15 inches of rain. We've done that because we've been heavily integrating technology into our irrigation practices. It's not just the data that we're collecting, we're also using soil moisture probes and variable rate and variable speed technology in order to better irrigate and provide that ongoing ability for agriculture to exist and to flourish in an area like ours. That forward thinking, that pre-planning, by hook or by crook or by luck, has become really a good glide path into what we're seeing in these slides that Doug and Barbara just showed us. We have an opportunity here to continue down this path and continue to get better. But it's not just about the integration of technology and the use of data. It's also about figuring out smart ways that we can better either regulate or incent different activities on the ground to make sure that we are planning ahead for what ultimately could be a much worse position than we're in today. We have a very robust cost share program to provide funds for a lot of those technology programs, but we also have a robust regulatory scheme. And I will venture, Chuck knows this from his time out at out in Scottsbluff, that that was not welcomed by a lot of our producers when we put those regulatory schemes into place. But today, I think that the vast majority of our landowners and producers would tell you that they are better because of it. When my father was farming 30 or 40 years ago, I'm sure he was pumping 25 or 30 inches to grow a corn crop. Today, they're pumping 10.5 inches in the same part of Nebraska. That's not just because of technology. It's certainly not just because of a government institution like the NRD. It's because of better seed technology and the kind of research that happens at a land-grant university like this one. But it is part of that. There is a component to that. The other thing that our board has recently done, and I'm very proud of this, is we've taken it upon ourselves to get very active in mitigation and resilience planning. I think we're one of only 2 NRDs in the state that have a drought mitigation plan that was a stakeholder-driven process, took 2 years. We brought people from all different sectors, from agriculture, from the medical community, from the faith-based community, from you name it, we had them involved. We had a stakeholder group of between 50 and 75 people throughout that 2-year process and put together a drought strategy that I think is unlike any other in this state and perhaps in the region. To plan for and put in measures in place if we have another 2012 or sadly if we have several 2012s in a row. The tabletop exercise was, what if we had 5 2012s in a row, where we had that reduction in precipitation and that extreme heat, what happens then? And so that scenario was played out, and that became our drought plan. And if you're interested in that, it's accessible on our website. It's, I think, a good read. We have an executive summary for those of you that have my attention span. The second area that we have focused on mitigation planning is each year, every NRD in the state, every 5 years, has to go through a disaster mitigation planning process with FEMA and NEMA. And this disaster mitigation process is predominantly designed to, focus on whether a particular community has a tornado siren or what have you. Our focus in this next round of mitigation planning, which is going to be coming up here in about 18 months, Mary Baker, who is here, I think, could probably tell you better than I, one of our components is going to be drought and how we integrate that drought management strategy into our mitigation plans. One last thing, because I know we're pressed for time, Martha, and I'm sorry that I'm a bit abbreviated, is though we have a much less average precipitation than you all here in this part of the state, I do want to mention a couple of things. Over the past 3 years, we have had 2,000-year rainfall events in Gearing Valley. Gearing Valley is a confined basin in the southern part of our district. It's about 40,000 acres of drainage, and we had 2 7-inch rainstorms in a row. That's sort of commonplace down here, or certainly down in Nemaha County, but that does not happen in Scottsbluff County, in southern Scottsbluff County. We are responsible, my NRD is responsible for a particular drain there that was funded by, largely by an appropriation from Senator Ben Nelson about 10 years ago called the Yensen Drain. That drain cost about $2.5 million to build. Last year we had to put another $1 million into it to repair it from those 2 rainstorms. The reason I bring that up is not just in the context of the flooding that's happening today. We had a 19-inch snowfall while you all were being inundated with the floods down here. We've had our extreme weather events as well. The reason I bring that up is our organization is a $6.5 million a year organization, largely funded by property tax. And when we have to put out an expenditure like that, $1 million expenditure to repair a drain, or the several hundred thousands of dollars that we spend each year in order to maintain those drainage systems in our part of the district. It takes away from some of these other opportunities. So my call to arms here today is the following. We have seen two different debates happening in the legislature this year. One of them is sort of the add-on to the climate study that was appropriated back in 2013, and what do we do about it? And unfortunately, that has died kind of a slow death. The second was the Tree Recovery Act, which has also sort of died a slow death because of the fiscal impacts of the Tree Recovery Act. If we don't have the legislature or other bodies that are responsible for financial impacts to even organizations like ours or to counties and the Department of Roads that are going to be replacing the 11 bridges that have been lost in these floods, we're going to at some point find ourselves stymied. We are there. The legislature took away a 3-cent levy authority for organizations like ours to do water management. Without that 3-cent levy authority, that takes away $1.5 million of my budget authority. Those are the kinds of things that we need to walk out of these rooms and remember when we talk to our public policy makers to remind them that not only is this an issue based on the science, not only are there organizations like ours that are doing something about it, but we need the resources in order to make that happen. I will stop there. Thank you, Martha.
You have a slide? I'm going to bring up a slide while you do your thing. Go ahead. I'm going to bring up a particular slide. Yeah.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes for Q&A, so I'd like to open it up for questions. And if you have a question, please raise your hand, and when I call on you, you can stand, and Tyler will bring you a microphone. Go ahead.
It was very interesting. I appreciated it. Have any of you been approached in the last week by any of our television stations? Have they asked you to talk about the flooding and about the impacts that this is going to have down the road and about mitigation efforts coming up? Have you reached out to them? Has there been any contact?
I am no longer a local, so I haven't been approached locally, but I was approached by a couple of national media. You'll find my name on a recent Forbes article, for example, to discuss such factors and also the media attention itself to the issues around here.
We do routine and regular updates with our media in my district, and we've talked to both the radio station and the TV station about not only the impacts of the flooding down here, but also the impacts of the extreme snowfall in our part of the state.
And I'll say just very quickly that the media some of the media are part of what we do on a regular basis. This afternoon we have a monthly webinar, for example, that we talk about the entire region from Michigan to Colorado. There'll be a lot of emphasis today on this area because of the issues. We talk about past climate and the outlooks, that kind of thing. So the media is aware of those, as well as the Corps of Engineers has been running a daily briefing in the afternoon for elected officials, state government, and media people that we're a part of. So there is some coverage, yeah.
Okay, another question?
Yes, I was wondering, is anyone doing any research on carbon capture? I mean, Nebraska has lost a lot of its organic matter in its soils. If we increase organic matter, we'll retain water and help in drought mitigation.
I think Tyler should probably answer that question.
Just a quick, that right after lunch, there'll be a speaker talking about that. So you can certainly add something, Doug, though.
Another question.
That's okay, Doug. Thank you for the report. It's very interesting and slightly scary at the same time. So I appreciate that. I did want to kind of touch on the quote that Doug made about talking to someone in when flying about climate change. And I wondered for the panel if there's a certain way that you approach the topic when talking to maybe individuals in the public about climate change and the research you do? If there are certain phrases you try to avoid or certain ways you communicate that?
I can at least start this conversation, and it'll actually come back to Laura Ingalls Wilder, because everything in my life seems to. And it is a matter of meeting people where they are and finding that common interest, and then framing a discussion, approaching the discussion in a way that is meaningful to them. So I do a lot of communication with people who are readers and scholars of Laura Ingalls Wilder books, which is largely teachers, historians, educators, and a few others, homeschoolers, culture, analysis, all of which are not audiences that would typically come to a meeting like this and talk about climate for a day. But I can go there and talk about Laura Ingalls Wilder and her weather and her climate and how the climate in her day looks different from the climate in our day, how they adapted in their day and would continue to adapt in this day. And what I'm doing is bridging those topics of conversation with an audience that either didn't care or perhaps even was antagonistic about talking about climate change. And the examples are in a number of different sectors. I could give similar stories when talking to pest management groups or certain groups of some of the farmers, not categorizing any of them that they're all, climate change deniers or people who don't listen, but that in any given audience, you have a distribution of people, some of whom have understood and studied and accept the evidence of climate change, some of whom have not. So when it comes down to it, meeting people where they are and starting that conversation from where their interests are is at least one approach. There are a lot of others, but I don't have an hour.
If I could just add, I think the way that we approach it is predominantly through economics. The landowners that we deal with on a daily basis may not be those that are going to be, respondents that say that they believe in climate change, but they do recognize the value and the benefit of the economic argument. Whether it's making the investment in a drain so that it doesn't collapse, or whether it is better timing their irrigation in order to reduce input costs. That has been sort of the needle that we've threaded, and it's worked very well in our part of the state.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you for your presentations, all of them. There's some things like the mention of the faster snow melt due to beetle kill by removing the shade. That's the kind of thing I think we'd all like to hear a lot more about, because it's very practical and to the point. My question is, have you seen, are you aware of a change in the nutritional value of the crops? I know I've heard things about the decrease of the protein value in crops, and I wonder if that's something that you're tracking. Thank you.
Well, certainly due to extreme weather events, we have that issue with forage. I've not heard that kind of conversation about corn, for example. Although sugar content, when you don't have heavy freezes over the course of a growing season for sugar beets, which are something we grow in western Nebraska, the sugar content inexorably goes down. So there are quantifiable things that you can point to say, because of reduced freeze days, that you might have reduced sugar. We've certainly seen protein values in forage go down, particularly during a drought like we had in 2012.
And just one more thing, sort of going back, not to address your question specifically, but going back to the question before that on speaking to different audiences, I think everybody said the right thing in terms of you talk to the audience that you have, right? And so I almost never try to be confrontational, even if someone is with me. I try to not be an advocate either. I have to sort of play sort of the middle line, but I point to the science. Again, I come back to that and try to explain it in terms that they understand, and ask them what they've seen in terms of changes. Well, I don't believe in climate change. Well, that's fine. What changes have you noticed? And then most people will tell you various things. I also want to point to this. I put this slide up very specifically because I want to make sure that a lot of you, I'm guessing, are speakers in and of yourself and communicators. There are, for each chapter within the report, there is a a PowerPoint file and a PDF file that you can download and use readily, and you're free to use them. You don't have to give anybody any notice or anything. We'd like to hear if you're using them, of course, but it's all open to the public, and so use it as you wish. We've done it much better this year than we have, or this time than the last time we did it. So there's a lot of material there for you to use on your own if you'd like. I'd also say that I'm speaking for all of us here a little bit. If you need speakers at various things, I can't go to everything. I don't live in Nebraska anymore. I live in Kansas City, but we know people who are here. There's one over there that lives in Hastings or a Grand Island who would be willing in the middle of the state to come out and speak to you. Tyler's another one. So there's a network of people. Kim is another one of people who know this stuff well enough to communicate it with you.
Okay, this ends our morning session. Please join me in giving a warm round of applause to our panelists.